Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. What if one decision, made in a moment of fear, haunted you for the next 20 years? She was just a teenager when she left her newborn at the hospital and walked away, believing it was the only way to survive. No goodbye, no name, just silence. But 2 decades later, fate intervenes, and a twist she never saw coming forces her to face the past she tried to forget. A reunion neither planned, and a secret that changes everything. This is a story about love lost, loyalty tested, and the powerful grip of regret. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. In the fluorescent-lit hallway of Mercy General Hospital, 17-year-old Brielle sat hunched over a form she couldn't bring herself to finish. Her fingers trembling as the pen hovered above the paper, like a bird too afraid to land. And every word, printed in black ink, felt like a chain tightening around her chest. The baby, only hours old, had barely stopped crying since birth, his tiny wails echoing off sterile walls. But Brielle couldn't bring herself to look into his face, because she feared that one glimpse would collapse every wall she'd built to survive. She had no mother to turn to, no father who stayed, and the boy who promised forever had vanished the moment the test turned positive, leaving her with broken dreams and a belly full of dread. The nurses had been kind, too kind, and their gentle coos to the baby were daggers to Brielle's soul, because she knew they would judge her for what she was about to do. Her friends had disappeared, her school stopped calling, and even the neighbors whispered behind curtains, a small-town punishment for teenage mistakes that couldn't be hidden beneath baggy sweaters anymore. She had always thought she'd be strong, stronger than her own mother who left when Brielle was just 5. But strength felt like a myth now, something only other girls had, the kind who didn't cry themselves to sleep. As the sun rose and painted the sky with gold that didn't reach her heart, Brielle stood up, looked once at the nursery through the glass, whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked out the hospital doors barefoot, leaving behind the weight of a name she couldn't give. The years that followed were both cruel and redemptive, filled with stints in shelters, fast food jobs, missed rent, and moments of peace that felt like borrowed time from a life she wasn't sure she deserved. And still, she never told anyone about the baby. She moved from state to state, town to town, changing her name like she changed cheap hair dye colors, hoping that reinvention could wash away regret. Love came and went, shallow romances that never rooted deep, because every time someone tried to love her, she remembered the infant with dark curls and a cry that pierced through everything. Therapy was too expensive, and religion too distant, and so she learned to survive by compartmentalizing pain, tucking it into boxes labeled later that she never opened again. Her 20s bled into her 30s, and though she smiled in photos and laughed at co-workers' jokes, inside she carried an emptiness that anniversaries and holidays only deepened. On the baby's birthday each year, she'd find herself staring at the sky, wondering if he had her eyes or his father's, if he liked peanut butter or hated it like she did, and whether he knew that somewhere out there, someone ached for him. She told herself he had a better life, one with lullabies and school lunches, and someone who showed up to every game, because believing anything else would kill what was left of her. Now in her late 30s, Brielle found work at a non-profit bookstore in Chicago that gave jobs to troubled youth, and there she met kids with scars on their wrists and eyes that had seen too much. And in them she saw fragments of herself. She poured herself into helping them, offering the kind of care she never received. And in return, they gave her a strange sense of peace, like maybe redemption could come in sideways ways. She still never told anyone about her son, even though sometimes, during closing shifts, she'd sit on the break room floor with a cup of tea and cry into her sleeves. She started journaling again, writing long letters addressed to the baby I left, pages she never intended to send but couldn't stop writing, because each word was a tiny stitch on a wound that still bled in silence. The world didn't know her secret, but it shaped everything she did, from how gently she spoke to the teens in the store, to how fiercely she defended the quiet ones who always sat alone. And though she tried not to think about him, sometimes she imagined bumping into him on a train or at a bus stop, a young man with her eyes and his father's grin, not knowing he was looking into the face of the woman who once walked away. In those daydreams she never spoke, only smiled and let him walk by, because forgiveness, she believed, was not hers to ask for anymore. Then came the day a new volunteer walked into the bookstore, tall and lanky with nervous eyes, and a crooked smile that felt like déjà vu. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Brielle felt her breath catch in her chest. His name was Aidan, he said, freshly graduated from college, eager to help, and when he shook her hand, her fingers trembled in a way she hadn't felt in 2 decades. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence, a trick of memory, but something about him burrowed into her thoughts and refused to leave, like a ghost she'd tried to outrun, finally catching up. He had a kindness to him, a quiet strength, and the way he spoke about his adoptive parents, with reverence and gratitude, made something in her ache with both pride and sorrow. She watched him from a distance, the way he interacted with the kids, how he listened without judgment, how he stayed late, even when he didn't have to. And slowly, dread and hope began to war inside her. She tried to find reasons to ask him questions, not wanting to seem intrusive, but desperate to know more. Where he was born, which hospital, what month, what day. Every answer felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, and by the end of the week, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, Brielle sat at the corner of her 1-bedroom apartment, clutching an old notebook where the first letter to her son had been written in smeared blue ink the year after she left, and the pages now felt heavier than ever in her lap. She lit a candle on the windowsill, more out of habit than ritual, but the flickering glow danced across the walls like tiny ghosts performing the grief she never voiced aloud. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it was trying to escape, demanding she do something, say something, but her lips stayed sealed as she stared at the name she had written over and over. "I'm sorry, baby." The realization that this young man, Aidan, might be the same child she had abandoned shattered whatever walls she'd built around her regret, and memories flooded her with unbearable clarity. She saw the hospital room again, the pale green curtains, the nurse's soft voice asking, "Are you sure?" and the way her body had trembled as she nodded yes, and walked away. She'd convinced herself that severing ties meant giving him a better chance, that her presence would only poison the possibility of a happy life, and now that illusion threatened to fall apart. What if this was fate offering her a second chance? Or worse, what if it was punishment disguised as opportunity? Over the next few days, Brielle found it impossible to concentrate on anything other than Aidan. who worked with the same quiet enthusiasm as before, entirely unaware of the storm raging just a few feet away in the woman who had once carried him inside her. She caught herself staring too long, caught in small bittersweet reveries as she watched him laugh with the kids or stack books with practiced precision, and every time he smiled, her heart ached with both pride and pain. She thought about blurting it out 100 times, pulling him aside, telling him the truth, begging him to believe her, but fear stitched her mouth shut, and instead she buried herself in work, sweeping the same aisle 3 times, just to distract her hands from shaking. When he talked about his adoptive parents, about their Sunday pancake traditions and their yearly camping trips, she both rejoiced and recoiled, because he had been loved in the way she never could have offered at 17. Still, something inside her whispered that blood mattered, that connection mattered, and that maybe, just maybe, knowing her might give him answers he didn't even know he was missing. At night, she reread his volunteer forms, again and again, her fingers trembling over his birthday, which matched exactly with the one etched forever into her memory. She cried in the break room when no one was looking, tears of confusion, guilt, hope, and dread all tangled together, like roots too deep to dig up without breaking. The moment everything truly unraveled came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when Aidan asked her if they had any books on adoption stories, his voice casual, unaware of the explosion he had just triggered inside her chest. Brielle froze, her hands tightening around a stack of donations, and for a second the world narrowed to only his face and the soft concern in his eyes as he asked again, slower this time, thinking maybe she hadn't heard. She managed to nod, her voice catching in her throat as she led him to a shelf in the back, her fingers brushing titles that had once comforted her in her loneliest years, books she'd donated from her own collection long ago. Aidan smiled, thanked her, and picked out a worn copy with a faded cover that Brielle recognized immediately, because she'd written a note inside it a decade ago. To the children searching and the mothers who wonder, your hearts still speak the same language. She almost told him then, the truth rising like a scream in her throat, but she swallowed it down, afraid of what it might ruin, of what it might mean if he looked at her and saw nothing. As he read the back of the book and nodded thoughtfully, she stepped away quickly, retreating into the storage room and collapsing against a wall, unable to breathe. She whispered, "God, what do I do?" into the silence, but the only response was the low hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of her own guilt. That evening, Brielle sat on her bed and opened the notebook again, flipping past years of ink-stained apologies until she reached a blank page, her pen shaking as she wrote the date at the top. She didn't know what she was going to say, only that she had to say something, because silence was starting to feel like betrayal, and the weight of unspoken truth threatened to drown her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling out in run-on lines, as if her heart had waited 20 years for permission to speak, and each sentence bled with memories she had buried under survival. She told him everything, about the fear, the loneliness, the night she left, the prayers she whispered every birthday, and the way she had seen him that day, and known in her bones who he was. She told him she'd never stopped loving him, not even once, and that she never expected forgiveness, only that he would know the truth about where he came from and why she disappeared. She wrote until her fingers cramped and the candle burned low, until the page blurred beneath tears that wouldn't stop falling. And when she finished, she didn't sign it with her name, only Mom, because it was the one word she'd never said out loud, and the one she wasn't sure she had the right to say anymore. In the morning, Brielle printed out a fresh copy of the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it inside the spine of the same book Aidan had borrowed, slipping it between pages 113 and 114, like a secret waiting to be discovered. She told herself this was the most she could do, the bravest she could be, and if he never found it, maybe that was the answer too. Maybe he wasn't meant to know. But she also knew that some things found their way to light when they were meant to, and her hands shook as she watched him walk in that afternoon, greet her with a grin, and slide the book onto the checkout counter without noticing the weight of her heart pressed inside it. She smiled back, a tremor behind her eyes, and said nothing as he placed it in his backpack and waved goodbye for the weekend, completely unaware that his life was about to change. The hours crawled by after he left, each minute stretching like thread, pulled too tight, and Brielle sat in the empty store after closing, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She imagined a dozen scenarios: rage, disbelief, rejection, confusion, but none of them prepared her for what would happen next. And yet, deep down, in the quietest part of her soul, she hoped for something else entirely, something small and impossibly precious, that he would read the letter and somehow choose not to hate her. 3 days passed without a word, and every hour became a battlefield between hope and despair, with Brielle checking her phone obsessively, even though he had no reason to call her. She wanted to go back in time to snatch the letter from the book before he saw it, to undo the risk, but the truth had already been set free, and now all she could do was wait. She dreamed of him, Aidan as a toddler, Aidan as a teenager, Aidan now, and in each dream he turned away from her, faceless and silent, a symbol of the distance she had created, with one irreversible choice. On the 4th day, just as she was preparing to close the store for the evening, the bell above the door rang, and there he was, standing in the doorway with the book in his hand and tears in his eyes. Brielle froze, her breath catching in her throat as he stepped forward, the room shrinking around them, until there was nothing left but this moment, and the truth hanging heavy between them. He didn't speak right away, and neither did she, the silence filled only with the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows, like the heartbeat of something long buried waking up. And then, finally, he asked in a voice so quiet it nearly broke her, "Is it true?" Brielle nodded, her throat too tight to form words, and in that fragile silence between them, something shifted, like the moment just before a dam breaks, and everything that's been held back rushes forward with unstoppable force. Aidan looked down at the book in his hands, then back up at her, his face unreadable, torn between 1,000 questions and emotions he hadn't had time to name. She stepped around the counter slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal she didn't want to startle. But really, it was her own fear she was trying not to disturb. His eyes were wet, but not angry, and that tiny grace allowed her to breathe again, just enough to say softly, "Yes, it's true. I'm your mother." The words hung in the air like smoke, intangible and dense, and Brielle felt as though the floor beneath her might open up and swallow her if he didn't say something soon. Aidan didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her like he was watching his entire world rearrange itself into something both new and strangely familiar. He finally whispered, and it was not bitter or accusatory, just desperately searching, like a child lost in a maze, calling out for someone to come find him. Brielle sat down on one of the reading stools beside the shelves, her hands trembling as she motioned for him to sit too, though she had no right to ask anything of him, not now. "I was 17, she began, her voice shaking as it reached back 2 decades, and scared and alone, and I convinced myself that leaving you was the only way to protect you from the mess I was. She told him everything, not just the surface facts, but the loneliness in that hospital room, the way her mother had disowned her, how she'd stood in the rain outside the foster home one night, just to glimpse where he might be. She explained that it wasn't because she didn't love him, it was because she did too much to ruin him with the chaos she lived in, too much to let him grow up resenting her. Aidan listened in silence, his fingers tracing the edge of the book cover, the same one that had carried the letter. The truth, the ache of 20 years compressed into fragile paper. Brielle kept speaking because she didn't know what else to do, because stopping might mean facing the possibility that her words were not enough to heal what she had broken. "I thought maybe you'd hate me if you ever found out," she said finally, her voice barely more than breath. "And maybe you still do. But I had to give you the truth, even if it was 20 years too late." For a long time, Aidan said nothing, and the silence between them became a bridge she didn't dare cross, afraid it might collapse under the weight of everything unsaid. Then, without warning, he pulled something from his pocket, a photo, worn and folded. A picture of himself as a baby with a woman she didn't recognize, his adoptive mother. "She's the one who raised me," he said, almost defensively, like he needed her to know that someone else had filled the space she had left. Brielle nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, because she didn't want to replace anyone, didn't expect to be anything except a truth he could carry forward however he chose. "She's wonderful," he added, more softly, and something in his voice cracked like glass under pressure. "But I always wondered who you were, why you left, if I mattered at all to the person who brought me into this world." That sentence shattered something inside her, because it was the question she had feared the most, and the one she'd written letters to answer in every journal she'd kept since the day she left. "You mattered," she whispered, almost gasping. "You mattered so much it broke me to let you go. Matters singe you mattered. She's duven toom something bästa men wes." He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes she saw not just pain but the same longing that had haunted her for years, a desire to understand, to connect, to make sense of the missing pieces. "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he could have said, because neither of them had a map for this kind of reunion, no blueprint for stitching two lifetimes together. "I'm not asking you to feel anything," Brielle said gently, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. "I just want you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." For the first time he smiled, not a full one but a flicker of something tentative and broken and real, and it was more than she ever thought she'd deserve. "I read the letter twice," he said suddenly. "Then again, I didn't know if it was real. But your handwriting matched the note in the book cover from all those years ago." Her breath caught. "You saw that?" He nodded slowly. "It made me cry." "I don't cry, but I did." That night, they didn't part as strangers anymore, but they didn't quite know what to be either. Not family, not yet, but something in between, like the pause between breaths before speaking. A difficult truth. Aidan didn't promise to stay in touch, and Brielle didn't ask, but when he left, he hugged her. The kind of embrace that was both hesitant and heartbreaking, like trying to remember the steps to a dance you never learned. She held him for just a second longer than he did her, and when they pulled away, neither said goodbye, as if the word might make it all feel too final. She watched him walk out into the rain again, the same as he had come in weeks before, but this time he carried not just a book, but a history. When the door closed behind him, she stood there alone again, but not in the same way as before. This time she held something to possibility. She didn't know if he'd come back, didn't dare expect it, but she knew one thing as surely as she had known his name. The moment she'd heard it, she had done the right thing. The truth was out now, and whatever came next would grow from it, not in the shadow of silence, but in the light of courage. Over the following days, Brielle went about her life with a strange calmness, like a storm had passed and left a silence that wasn't quite peace, but it was still. She folded laundry with steadier hands, brewed her morning coffee with less dread, and found herself listening to songs she once couldn't bear to hear because they reminded her too much of what she'd lost. The volunteers at the bookstore didn't mention anything, though one or two of them gave her longer glances, as if they sensed something had shifted behind her eyes. She stopped looking for Aidan around every corner, but not because she didn't care. It was because something in her trusted that if he ever came back, he would come on his own terms. Her nights were quieter now, less tormented, though still sleepless sometimes, filled with imagined conversations of what else she might say if given the chance. She began writing again, not apology letters, but journal entries, ones that talked about the future instead of the past, because for the first time in decades, she believed there might be one. And in the deepest part of her, she held on to a single fragile hope that healing could come slowly, like sunlight through stained glass, fractured but still beautiful. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning, as she opened the shop early to restock new arrivals, the bell above the door rang, and she turned to see Aidan standing there with 2 coffees in his hands. He didn't say anything at first, just smiled, and offered one of them to her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She took it with trembling fingers, blinking hard, trying not to cry, and he just said, "I thought maybe we could talk, if you're not too busy." She nodded, and they sat on the floor between the fiction and memoir sections, surrounded by words other people had written to make sense of life, and together they started writing their own story. Not perfect, not easy, but real, and that, Brielle realized, was more than she'd ever dreamed of when she left that hospital 20 years ago. The bookstore was unusually quiet that morning, and as Brielle sipped the coffee Aidan had brought her, she realized it had been 2 decades since they had shared even the smallest of moments like this. Across from her, he sat cross-legged with his back against a shelf labeled Family and Relationships, an irony not lost on either of them, as the silence stretched comfortably. He was watching her now, not with suspicion or guardedness, but with curiosity, like he was discovering a part of himself he never knew had gone missing until recently. She studied him too, tracing the contours of his face for the 100th time, trying to find herself in his eyes, in his jawline, in the way his mouth curved slightly upward when he was deep in thought. There was so much she wanted to ask about his childhood, his dreams, his fears, but she held back, knowing that time was the only honest bridge between them. "You look like your father," she finally said, quietly, and the words fell into the space between them like a stone into a still lake. Aidan raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued, as he leaned forward slightly and asked, what was he like? Brielle exhaled, leaning back against the front counter, her eyes going somewhere far away, to a time when she was a girl with scraped knees and more hope than sense. "He was kind," she said softly, her voice laced with memory, not the kind of kind you notice right away, but the kind that stays with you long after he's gone. "He played guitar like it was the only thing that made sense to him, and he used to hum to you when I was pregnant, thinking you could hear him through my skin." Aidan smiled faintly, a flicker of something tender passing through his expression, but he didn't interrupt. "He wanted to be there," she continued, eyes glistening now, but he never got the chance. His family moved away before I gave birth, and I didn't even get to tell him I was pregnant. I tried writing once, but I didn't know where they'd gone. The weight of old grief settled between them like dust in a forgotten room, and Aidan reached for the coffee cup in front of him, as if it could steady what he was feeling. "You were really alone, weren't you?" he asked. And it wasn't a question meant to provoke guilt. It was simply an acknowledgement, a reaching out. Brielle nodded, the admission coming easier now that the truth had started to live in the open. "Yes," she said, "but that's not an excuse for what I did. I made a choice I have to live with every day. The truth is, I left that hospital with my heart in pieces, believing you'd have a better chance without me." Aidan was quiet again, and for a moment all they could hear were the soft hums of the air conditioner and the whisper of a passing car outside. "You know," he said slowly, "growing up, I never felt unwanted. My parents, they're incredible. But sometimes, at night, I'd lie awake and wonder what I must have done to make someone walk away before they even knew me." Brielle's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob that caught her by surprise, and she whispered, "You did nothing wrong. You were perfect." The room suddenly felt too small for the ache they were both carrying, and Aidan stood up, pacing for a moment, his fingers running through his hair like he was trying to sort through years of unspoken feelings. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said, turning to face her again. "I didn't even come here expecting anything. I just needed to see you." Brielle rose slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the moment might vanish like a mirage. "And now that you've seen me," she asked, her voice small, her heart already preparing for another kind of abandonment. Aidan hesitated, then stepped closer, so close she could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, and smell the faint scent of pine from his jacket. "Now I want to know who you are," he said simply, and the words lit something inside her she thought had died long ago. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the fragile beginning of something that might one day become it. Later that afternoon, they sat together going through a box of old journals Brielle had kept locked away for years, pages filled with letters she'd written to a child she believed she'd never meet. Some were tear-stained, some angry, some filled with a quiet hope she hadn't dared speak aloud until now. Aidan read them slowly, carefully, as if touching sacred scripture, and with each word his walls began to shift, not crumble, but soften. "I kept these because it was the only way I could stay close to you," Brielle explained. "I knew I might never get to say these things out loud." Aidan folded one letter gently and said, "I don't know how to process all this, but I'm glad you kept them. They make me feel remembered." The word cut deep into her, deeper than he would ever know, because that was her greatest fear, that he would feel erased. "You were never forgotten," she whispered, placing her hand over his. "Not for a single second." They closed the bookstore early that day, an unspoken agreement that some stories were too sacred to be shared in public view. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, painting the windows with soft gold, Aidan lingered by the door, unsure of what to say, or whether saying anything would ever be enough. Brielle stood beside him, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too deeply, in case the moment shattered like glass. "I'm not ready to call you Mom," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm not walking away either." She nodded, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give," she said. "Even just today." He smiled, a little sad, a little hopeful, and opened the door. "I'll come back," he added, over his shoulder, and she watched him disappear into the fading light, her chest full of empty spaces that, for the first time, didn't feel quite so hollow. In the quiet that followed, Brielle locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood in the center of the bookstore, feeling the weight of her choices and the lightness of the future trying to bloom. She knew this wouldn't be easy, that healing wasn't linear, and that some days would reopen old wounds. But she also knew something else, something sacred. Love, no matter how delayed, was still love. And sometimes, coming back was the bravest thing a person could do. She pressed her hand to her chest, right over her heart, and whispered his name, letting it echo through the spaces that used to ache. Aiden, her son, her redemption, her second chance. Brielle woke up the next morning with a heaviness in her chest that didn't come from sadness, but from the fragile hope that had taken root in her ribcage overnight, like a timid vine reaching for sunlight it never expected. She moved through her apartment like she was learning how to live again, brushing her teeth with trembling hands, making breakfast and burning the toast, because her mind was caught somewhere between memory and possibility. The sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, and she stood there barefoot, holding a chipped mug of coffee, and wondering what her life would have been like if she'd made a different choice 20 years ago. Would they be sitting at this very table talking about college applications, or broken hearts, or bad dreams that only a mother could chase away with whispered promises? The thoughts pressed against her chest like an avalanche, but she didn't let them crush her. She let them teach her instead. Regret, she was learning, didn't have to be a prison. Sometimes it could be a compass, and right now, it was pointing her straight toward him. Meanwhile, across the city in a cozy apartment with books stacked like bricks and a cat named Mercury curled in a patch of sunlight, Aiden sat at his desk replaying the last 24 hours like a movie he couldn't stop watching. The disbelief still clung to his skin like a second layer, but underneath it was something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to longing. He opened his laptop to finish editing an article due that evening, but his fingers hovered over the keys, unable to type a single word that didn't somehow lead back to her. Who was she, really? The woman who gave him life and then left him to live it without her? Was she a villain, a victim, or just a teenager who had no idea how to survive her own brokenness? His heart didn't know how to label her, and for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe he didn't need to. Maybe it was enough to just know she was still here, still trying. Later that day, Aiden found himself walking down the same street that led to Brielle's bookstore, the smell of paper and old ink guiding him like a scent trail from childhood. He didn't plan to visit her again so soon, but his feet had their own kind of memory now, and they took him where his heart hadn't yet admitted it wanted to go. When he stepped through the glass door, the bell above it chimed a little too loudly, and Brielle looked up from behind the counter like she'd been waiting her whole life to hear that sound again. She smiled, not wide, not expectant, but soft and surprised, like hope was still something she didn't trust, but wanted to believe in again. Twice in 2 days, she said gently, trying not to let her voice shake. I must be dreaming. Aiden shrugged, brushing snow from his coat, his mouth twitching with something between sarcasm and sincerity. Don't get used to it. They spent the next hour not talking about the past, but about books and weather, and how Mercury liked to sleep on his keyboard at the worst possible moments. It was strange and beautiful, this kind of conversation, light enough to carry, but heavy enough to mean something. At one point, Brielle reached for a notebook and handed it to him, her hand brushing his, as she whispered, "If there are things you want to ask, anything, I want to be the one to answer them." Aiden took the notebook, but didn't open it, just held it, like it might hold the keys to every question he'd buried. under years of silence. "I don't know what to ask yet," he said, honestly, "but I'll let you know when I do." That moment became a thread between them, invisible but unbreakable, and it anchored something inside both of them that had been drifting for far too long. That night, Brielle sat alone in the dark, reading over one of her old letters to him, the words bleeding through the page like whispers from her younger self. She was struck by how much pain and love could exist in the same sentence, how a girl with nothing but a hospital bracelet and a breaking heart could still believe she might be forgiven one day. She pressed the letter to her lips like a prayer and whispered, "Thank you for coming back," even though he wasn't there to hear it. Across town, Aidan lay awake in bed, the notebook Brielle had given him resting on his nightstand like a ghost of conversations yet to come. He wondered what she dreamed about, if she still woke up sometimes thinking she heard the sound of a baby crying, or if the silence had become her lullaby. In the days that followed, they began to build something that didn't have a name yet, but felt a little like trust and a little like slow-burning hope. They met for coffee, shared stories that had nothing to do with pain, and laughed in quiet moments when they both forgot how much hurt there still was to heal. Brielle didn't push, and Aidan didn't pull away, and somehow that rhythm worked like a language only they could understand. One afternoon, he asked her what her favorite memory of him was, and she blinked back tears as she told him about the first time she felt him kick. How it felt like a tiny heartbeat echoing inside her own. "It was the first time I realized I wasn't alone," she said, and Aidan looked down at his hands like he was holding that moment in his palms. But healing is never linear, and grief has a way of hiding in unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to sink its teeth into old wounds. One evening, while helping Brielle close up the shop, Aidan stumbled across a box labeled maternity records and froze. Without asking, without thinking, he opened it, and inside were photos of her pregnant, ultrasounds, discharge papers, and a note that simply read, "Forgive me." The air between them shifted like a storm front rolling in, and Brielle turned around just in time to see his expression change from curiosity to devastation. "You kept all this," he whispered, the disbelief in his voice like a blade, "and still you left." The question wasn't cruel, but it landed with all the weight of a scream, and Brielle's shoulders sagged under its truth. She stepped toward him slowly, her face pale and open, the kind of raw vulnerability that couldn't hide even if it wanted to. "I kept it because it was all I had of you," she said, tears already spilling, "and I left because I didn't know how to stay." For the first time since they met, Aidan saw her not just as the woman who had abandoned him, but as the frightened girl who had tried to hold on to a life falling apart in her hands. The box between them was no longer a collection of artifacts. It was a shrine to a decision that had shaped them both in ways they were only just beginning to understand. He didn't say anything else, just closed the box gently and set it aside, his silence louder than any accusation. Brielle sat down on the floor, her back against the counter, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Aidan." And though he didn't answer, he sat down beside her, their shoulders touching, their breaths falling into the same rhythm. The next morning dawned quietly, the sky a muted grey that looked as though it were holding its breath, just like the two of them did from opposite ends of the city, waking to a world that felt softer but heavier than before, as if the truth had settled into the floorboards overnight. Aidan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth with absent-minded strokes, his eyes not seeing his reflection but the image of his mother on the bookstore floor whispering, "I'm sorry," like it was the only language she remembered. He didn't know what to do with the tenderness he'd seen in her eyes, or the box of memories she had clung to, like a life raft in a sea of guilt for 2 decades. It would have been easier if she were heartless, if she had walked away and never thought twice. But the truth was 1,000 times harder, because it meant she had loved him, deeply, painfully, endlessly, from afar. And that love, real and raw and unfinished, complicated everything he thought he understood about her, about himself, about the story of who he was supposed to be. Brielle spent her morning organizing shelves. She had already organized, wiping counters that were already clean, and replaying every second of the night before, like a song she couldn't stop humming, even though it broke her heart with every note. She had seen something in Aidan's eyes that she hadn't dared to hope for, a question instead of a verdict, curiosity instead of condemnation, and it had wrapped itself around her chest with a strange kind of ache. She hadn't slept at all, terrified that the small progress they'd made would dissolve like morning dew, and that he'd disappear again with all the pain she'd spent her life trying to outrun. But she also knew this wasn't about her anymore. It hadn't been since the day she left him wrapped in a blue hospital blanket, with his name left blank on the birth certificate. He deserved to ask anything, to feel everything, to hurt, and to rage, and to hope if he wanted. Her only job now was to stay. That evening he returned to the shop again, this time without hesitation, carrying the notebook she'd given him, and something else she couldn't quite read in his face. They didn't hug, they didn't smile, they just nodded like 2 people who had been through the same fire, and knew better than to speak too quickly while the embers still glowed. He placed the notebook on the counter between them and opened it to a page titled, "Things I Wish You'd Told Me," and her breath caught in her throat at how neat his handwriting was, and how small each letter seemed, like he was afraid the words would collapse under the weight of themselves. He didn't ask her to read it out loud, but she did anyway, her voice trembling as she read his questions about who she was before she became his mother, what she felt the moment she held him, whether she had thought of him on his birthdays, and whether she ever tried to find him. Her hands shook as she read them, but she didn't look away. When she finished, the silence sat between them for a long time, heavy but not cold, sacred in its quiet permission to let things breathe. Then, in a voice soft and deliberate, she began to answer, not with practiced speeches or carefully chosen words, but with the messy truth of a girl who was never ready to be a mother, but had never stopped being one in her heart. She told him how she had gone into labor alone in a hospital hallway, because her own parents had locked the door when they found out she was pregnant, how she named him in her head even though she never got to write it down, and how she watched the nurse carry him away and wanted to scream but didn't, because she thought it was what love looked like. Her words were soaked in memory and regret, and the aching kind of love that never gets easier. And Aidan listened without interrupting, letting each word carve a new path through the stone wall he had built to survive. They began to meet every few days, not always to talk about the past, but sometimes just to exist near each other, side by side, like 2 people rebuilding something without a blueprint. One afternoon, they walked to a park near Brielle's apartment, and she watched with quiet reverence as Aidan helped an elderly man who had fallen near the bench. The gentleness in his voice, the steadiness of his hands, the way he listened, these were things she hadn't taught him, but had always hoped he'd learn, and seeing them made her feel like maybe some pieces of her had reached him anyway. "You're kind," she said softly, as they sat down, and he looked at her like he didn't quite believe it. "I try," he replied, and she nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. Trying, after all, was sometimes the most a person could do. But not every meeting was gentle, and not every word was kind, because healing is jagged and grief is sharp. And 20 years of silence doesn't melt overnight. There were moments when Aidan raised his voice, when pain spilled out of him like water from a dam, and he asked why she hadn't come back when she finally had her life together, why she hadn't fought harder to find him once she had her bookstore and her apartment and her second chance. Brielle didn't defend herself, not out of weakness, but because she knew some questions didn't have answers that made sense, and some wounds didn't need closure so much as they needed time. "I was scared," she said more than once, and Aidan learned to hear what that really meant. "I didn't think I deserved you," and maybe he wasn't ready to forgive her completely. But something inside him softened each time he saw her trying, each time she chose presence over perfection. One night, Aidan called her instead of visiting, and she answered the phone like it was something sacred, her voice breathless with surprise and hope. "I think I want to know my birth name," he said quietly, and she closed her eyes, leaning against the kitchen wall as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I named you Levi," she whispered, the name like a lullaby carried through time. "It means joined in harmony." Aidan didn't speak for a long time after that, and when he finally did, his voice cracked around the edges. "Thank you," he said, and she whispered, "Thank you for letting me tell you." In that moment, they weren't strangers or broken things, or people who had once hurt each other beyond words. They were a mother and son, suspended in the sacred space between past and future, finally saying the things they had been too afraid to speak aloud. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. Not a full healing, not a perfect ending, but a new beginning written in the margins of everything they had both lost. They began to plan a small trip together, a weekend away from the city, just the two of them, a quiet place with no memories attached, where they could write new ones. Brielle packed her bag like a mother, sending herself off to her first day of school, folding clothes with nervous hands and hope tucked into every crease. Aidan brought his camera, intending to document their time, not for the world but for himself, so he could remember what it felt like to be chosen, even if it came years later than expected. In a small cottage by a lake, they shared stories late into the night, cooked simple meals, and laughed about nothing in particular. And for the first time, it felt like maybe the years hadn't been wasted after all. They had found each other, and sometimes that was enough. Aidan returned to his apartment after the trip, feeling like his body had come home, but his soul was still sitting beside the lake, watching the reflection of the stars ripple in the water, like quiet promises never spoken aloud. There was something about that weekend, its simplicity, its silence, its slowness, that had peeled back the layers of distance he had wrapped around his heart for so long. He didn't tell anyone about it, not even Claire, who noticed something had shifted in him, but didn't press, choosing instead to sit beside him and wait, like someone waiting for the tide to return what the sea had taken. He wanted to tell her, wanted to explain the strange blend of peace and pain that now followed him like a shadow, but the words felt fragile, like they might break, if spoken too soon. So he stayed quiet, holding the memories close, and letting them settle inside him like roots finding their place. Brielle, too, found herself walking through her bookstore differently, touching the spines of books with more reverence, smiling at strangers with a softness that hadn't lived in her before, because for the first time in 20 years, she no longer felt like a ghost walking through someone else's life. The silence that had once kept her safe now felt like a cage she no longer wanted to live in, and with every day that passed, she felt herself breathing deeper, standing taller, and trusting that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of love after all. She printed the photo Aidan had taken of her by the lake, wind in her hair, eyes closed, laughter caught mid-flight, and placed it on her bedside table like a small monument to survival. It was a picture of a woman who had lost everything and still found the courage to begin again. And each time she looked at it, she whispered, "Thank you, Levi," as if saying his name could rewrite time. But peace is never a straight road, and healing often brings up the hurt we thought we buried. And for Aidan, the silence that once protected him now began to feel like betrayal, especially as he started to understand all the ways he had been raised without answers. He began asking questions of his adoptive parents, gently at first, then with growing urgency, wondering why they had never told him the truth about the circumstances of his adoption, about the young girl who had cried over him in a hospital room she had to leave alone. They had always told him he was chosen, special, loved without condition, and he had believed them, but now he felt like part of that love had been wrapped in fear, in the desire to protect him from pain by pretending it never existed. His adoptive mother, Carol, sat him down one evening and admitted that they had been afraid that if he knew the truth, he would feel unwanted, unloved, or worse, that he would go searching for someone who had once left him behind. "I never stopped loving you," she said, tears streaming down her face, "and I thought keeping that part of your story hidden would keep you safe from the sadness." Aidan took her hands gently and said, "But the sadness was already there. It just didn't have a name." It was the first time they had cried together in years, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Not a rupture, but a reckoning, a shared understanding that love was never meant to erase pain, but to walk beside it. He didn't blame them anymore, not fully, not blindly, but he also knew that healing required truth, and he couldn't build a whole self from half stories. So he promised to keep walking both paths, the one that led back to Brielle and the one that still lived in the home where he'd grown up, because both had shaped him, and both deserved a place in his heart. Meanwhile, Brielle faced her own confrontation with silence when she received a letter from her estranged father, written in shaky handwriting on yellowed paper that smelled like dust, and something older than forgiveness. He had heard, through distant family whispers, that she was seeing her son again, and for the first time in 2 decades he asked her to visit. She stared at the letter for days, unable to decide whether opening that door would reopen the wound or help it close. But Aidan's forgiveness, tentative as it was, had given her strength she didn't know she had, and one Sunday morning she got on a bus to the town she had once fled with her stomach full of shame and her heart full of fear. Her father's house was smaller than she remembered, quieter too, and when he opened the door, he looked like someone who had been waiting a lifetime to say something he didn't know how to say. They sat in silence at first, 2 people who had once shared a home but never shared their hearts, drinking tea that neither of them touched, and letting the clock tick away their awkwardness. Eventually he said, "I was wrong," and those 3 words, so simple, so late, cracked something open in her. He told her he had been angry, confused, scared of what people would say, and ashamed of himself for not protecting her when she needed him most. "I thought if I pushed you away, it would erase the shame," he whispered. "But all it did was leave me alone with it." Brielle cried then, not for his apology, but for the years that had been lost in the space between what should have been said and what never was. They didn't make promises that day, didn't pretend everything could be fixed, but they sat beside each other long enough to remember what it felt like to be father and daughter, and sometimes that was the beginning of something better. Back in the city, Aidan began to write more. Stories, journal entries, poems that never rhymed but always bled, and found that language had become his way of unburdening the silence he had carried since childhood. He started reading at open mic nights, sharing pieces of himself with strangers who clapped, not because they knew him, but because they understood pain when they heard it. One night, Brielle came to watch him read, standing in the back of the room with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears brimming as he recited a piece called The Girl in the Hospital Hallway, and even though he never said her name, she knew every word was for her. When he finished, he didn't look for applause, he looked for her eyes, and when he found them, she mouthed, "Thank you," and he nodded like a son who had finally found the sound of his mother's heartbeat in his own voice. Their relationship was still fragile, still full of pauses and missteps, but it was real, and that made it worth continuing, even on the days when it felt too heavy to carry. They began to collect small rituals, Sunday breakfasts, afternoon walks through old bookstores, letters slipped into each other's mailboxes with questions like, "What was your favorite childhood book?" or "What scared you most at 17?" These rituals weren't grand, but they were sacred in their quiet persistence, like stitches in a seam that once tore open too wide. Through these small acts of presence, they began to understand that love was less about perfect timing and more about showing up again and again, until the wounds had somewhere soft to land. Aidan still struggled with resentment sometimes. Brielle still faced waves of guilt she couldn't always swim through. But together, they were learning that forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a decision made over and over, in the ordinary moments where love had the chance to try again. The autumn leaves began to scatter across the sidewalks, like forgotten pages of a story waiting to be reread. And Aidan found himself staring at the trees more often, wondering how something could look so beautiful while it was dying, and if maybe people were the same in the seasons of their own undoing. He started dreaming of the hospital again, the white walls, the fluorescent lights, the sound of a baby crying down the hallway, and though he hadn't been old enough to remember it, his mind seemed to recreate it in fragments, as if his soul had never really left that place. He finally asked Brielle about the moment she left him, about what she had been thinking, feeling, fearing, and though the question hurt her like a blade, she knew it was time for him to hear it all. They met in the back corner of a quiet cafe, and with shaking hands, she began to speak, not as a woman defending her choices, but as a girl who had once been too broken to hold anything that mattered. She told him about the panic that crawled beneath her skin, the shame that screamed louder than any lullaby, the nurses who offered comfort she didn't know how to accept, and the moment she placed him in the bassinet and whispered, "I'm sorry," as if that would be enough to fill the empty crib of the life he would live without her. Aidan listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers, his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles went white, because part of him wanted to hate her again, to scream and curse and tell her she didn't deserve to be here now. But another part of him, quieter, older, softer, understood that sometimes people break under the weight of choices they never had the strength to carry in the first place, and he saw not a villain before him, but a girl who had grown up inside a wound she had never been allowed to heal. When she finished, there was silence between them, the kind that doesn't demand a response, but waits patiently for understanding to bloom. That night, Aidan returned home and pulled out the adoption file he'd always kept in a shoebox beneath his bed, the one with hospital records, scribbled notes, and a single photo of him as an infant, his eyes wide open, staring at something that could have been hope or confusion, or maybe both. For years he'd looked at that photo and wondered if the woman who had left him had ever looked back, if she'd stood outside the hospital doors and cried, or if she had run without turning around. And now he knew the answer was both. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter, not to Brielle, but to the baby he had once been, telling him that he had grown up loved, strong, curious and scarred, but also brave, and that the woman who had left had come back not to rewrite the past, but to ask for a place in the present. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew this letter was the beginning of choosing to live without bitterness as his compass. Meanwhile, Brielle stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair slowly like she had as a teenager, wondering what it would have been like to raise Aiden, to pack his lunch for school, to read him bedtime stories, to hear him call her mom with the sleepy voice of childhood innocence. The grief came in waves, not only for what she had missed, but for what he had lived without. And she cried not just because she was sorry, but because she couldn't go back and make it different. Still, she felt a strange gratitude rising within her, a thankfulness for second chances, for forgiveness offered without a guarantee, and for the chance to stand beside her son not as a ghost from his past, but as a woman who would walk the road with him now. She bought him a book that week, an old copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, and wrapped it with twine, leaving a note inside that said, "Real isn't how you're made. It's a thing that happens when someone loves you long enough." Aiden found the gift in his mailbox and sat with it in his lap for a long time before opening it, the weight of the gesture settling into him like a prayer he didn't know how to say. He hadn't read that book since he was a child, but as he turned the pages, he realized that every sentence felt like it had been written just for them, about broken things becoming whole, about love making you real, about being seen, even when you don't feel worthy. He texted Brielle later that night, "Thank you for the book, and for still showing up," and she replied with a heart emoji, followed by a message that said, "I'll never stop showing up, even when it's hard." That was the night they began texting each other daily. Not always deep conversations, but enough to weave a steady thread between their lives that had once been cut too short. They talked about their favorite songs, the weather, their dreams, and every so often about the pain, never letting it define them but never pretending it wasn't there. But healing has its tests, and for Aiden that test came in the form of an unexpected message from his birth father, a name he had never wanted to see, attached to a past he had buried in the shadows of his mind. The man had seen a photo of Aiden at the open mic, shared on social media by someone in the audience, and somehow recognized the features he had once chosen to ignore. The message was short. "I think I might be your father, if you're open to it. I'd like to talk." Aiden stared at the screen for hours, feeling the ground beneath his feet shift again, unsure whether this was fate offering another piece of the puzzle, or life trying to test how much pain he could carry without breaking. He told Brielle the next morning, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable, because she had spent 2 decades trying to protect him from the shadow of that man, and now the shadow had found them both again. They met at the park that afternoon, both walking in silence for a while, the leaves crunching beneath their feet, like memories that refused to be quiet, and Brielle told him the truth she had never spoken, not out of malice, but out of fear. She told him that the man who claimed to be his father had never wanted a child, had denied her when she cried in a hospital hallway, and had never once asked where the baby went after she left. She begged Aiden to be careful, not because she wanted to control him, but because she had seen how easy it was to be hurt by someone who never wanted to love in the first place. Aiden listened quietly, torn between wanting to believe people could change and fearing that some doors should stay closed forever. And in that moment he realized that forgiveness and boundaries could live in the same heart. He promised her that he would think carefully before responding, that he would not rush into a reunion just to chase a phantom that might never become a person. That night, Aiden sat down with Claire and told her everything, about Brielle, about the message, about the confusion pulling him in too many directions at once. And she took his hand and said, "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just don't shut yourself off again." Her words reminded him that love wasn't always about answers, but about presence. And sometimes, just sitting with someone in the unknown could be the most honest kind of love. He still hadn't decided whether to respond to the man's message, but he knew that whatever choice he made, it would be his, and that in itself was a kind of freedom he had never known before. He pulled out the letter he had written to his younger self and added a final line: "You were never alone. You were always loved, even when it didn't feel like it." Then he folded it gently and placed it beneath the photo from the hospital, closing the shoebox with reverence, as if sealing a chapter, not with anger but with grace. Aidan sat on the edge of his bed that morning with the phone still in his hand, rereading the message from the man who claimed to be his father, letting the weight of those words press down on his chest like an anchor made of questions he didn't know how to ask. The sun filtered through the curtains in soft streaks, and for a moment the world felt calm despite the storm swirling inside him, like time was waiting for him to make a decision before moving forward again. He wondered what a conversation with this man would even sound like. Would it be a confrontation, a confession, a lie disguised as sincerity, or something worse, something empty? The thought of facing someone who had walked away before he was even born felt like opening a door that might lead to more abandonment, and yet there was a part of him, fragile and hopeful, that wanted to see if maybe this time someone might stay. He hadn't told Claire his decision yet, because even though her support was unwavering, he needed to sit with it alone, to own the choice without letting love make it for him. He texted the man back late that afternoon with a simple message: "We can meet for coffee tomorrow at 3 at the cafe on 9th and Bay." He waited for a reply that came too quickly, too eager, and for a while he regretted reaching out, as if a part of him had already known that some doors weren't meant to be opened, no matter how curious you were. Brielle called him that night, sensing the shift in his tone, and when he told her what he had done, she didn't scold him or cry or beg. She simply said, "Be careful with your heart, Aidan. Some people don't know how to hold it." He promised her he would be, though he wasn't sure if he believed it, because part of him still believed in the fairy tales no one ever read to him as a child, where fathers came back and explained everything in a single hug. That night, sleep was elusive, the kind that dances just beyond reach, and when dreams finally came, they were strange and heavy, filled with the image of a man standing just out of focus, always turning away. The cafe was quiet the next day, filled with the hum of soft jazz and the clinking of spoons against ceramic mugs, and Aidan sat near the window with his hands around a lukewarm cup of tea, watching the door like it held the answer to every question he'd ever asked. When the man walked in, tall and greying with a weathered look that spoke of years lost to silence, Aidan stood but didn't smile, offering only a nod that felt like both a greeting and a warning. The man introduced himself as Thomas, and his voice carried the nervous tremor of someone trying to find footing on unfamiliar ground. And Aidan listened as he launched into a story about youth, mistakes, regret, and a life lived without knowing if he had left something or someone behind. But the more Thomas spoke, the more Aidan realized that this man hadn't searched for him out of love, but out of guilt, or maybe curiosity, as if discovering a long-lost receipt for a purchase, never made, but never returned. There was no warmth in the words, no tenderness in the recollections, only vague acknowledgments of choices made badly, and a hollow request for a second chance without the weight of the first. Aidan asked him why. Why now? Why after all this time? Why reach out when he had never looked before? And Thomas shrugged in that detached way that people do when the truth is too small to satisfy a wound so wide. He said he'd seen the video, the one from the open mic night, and something about Aidan's eyes made him feel like he had missed out on something important. And Aidan felt himself clench because he was not a missed opportunity or a reminder of a life unlived. He was a person who had survived without him. The conversation dragged on, filled with long pauses and short sentences, and when it ended, Aidan left first, pushing open the door with a breath of air that felt like release. Outside, the sky was grey but dry, and Aidan walked without a destination, trying to process the strange hollowness that followed him like a shadow that had learned how to speak. He didn't feel anger so much as he felt tired of expecting closure from people who had never given him an opening, tired of wondering if his worth depended on the return of someone who had never known how to stay. He called Brielle and told her everything, and when his voice cracked, she said, "I'm proud of you, not for meeting him, but for walking away when you saw he didn't deserve your forgiveness yet." Her words settled into him like a blanket on a cold night, not fixing the ache, but reminding him he wasn't alone in it, and for the first time he realized that letting go could be a form of love too. Later that evening, Claire came over with takeout and a bottle of wine, and they sat on the couch with a blanket between them, watching reruns of old shows neither of them cared about, but both of them needed the noise. He told her about the meeting, about the emptiness of it, and she squeezed his hand and said, "You're not defined by who didn't raise you. You're defined by who you've become in spite of it." Her faith in him always felt like a lighthouse, something steady and bright, no matter how dark the water became. And he leaned into her shoulder, letting himself be held without words. They talked until midnight, and then sat in silence for a while, both grateful for the way silence could sometimes speak louder than any comfort. That night, Aidan wrote again, not to his younger self, but to his future son, should he ever have one, pouring onto paper all the things he wished someone had told him, growing up, about pain, about love, about the strength it takes to stay. He wrote about Brielle, about her courage, her regret, her redemption, and how she had come back not to erase her mistakes, but to own them, and how that had taught him more about love than any apology ever could. He ended the letter with, "You will never have to wonder if you were wanted," and folded it neatly, placing it beside the others in the box that no longer felt like a shrine to what was missing, but a museum of how far he'd come. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and Aidan fell asleep with the window cracked open, letting the cool air remind him that even after hard winters, new seasons always come. The next morning, Brielle called to say she'd made something for him, an old photo album she had started piecing together with copies of the pictures the adoption agency had sent her over the years, pictures she had collected in silence, ashamed to ask, but desperate to see him grow. When he opened the album that afternoon, his eyes welled up at the sight of him at 6 months, grinning with one tooth and arms outstretched toward a camera, and he realized that even though she had left, she had never truly let go. There was something holy about the album, about the way each photo told a story of absence stitched together with hope, and he held it close like a heartbeat he had almost forgotten to listen to. That night, he texted her, "I forgive you not because it was easy, but because you came back," and she responded with 3 words that meant everything. "I never stop." Brielle sat at a small kitchen table, the afternoon light casting long golden lines across the cluttered stack of letters she had written over the years, all addressed to Aidan but never sent, each envelope sealed with trembling hands, and a prayer she never dared to mail. The letters varied in tone, some apologetic, some hopeful, some written in the early hours of the morning after a dream of him had left her crying into her pillow, and others filled with mundane details about her life, as if trying to offer him proof that she had become someone worth knowing. For years she had written one every birthday, sometimes on Christmas, and once on what would have been his high school graduation day, imagining him in a cap and gown, wondering if he looked like her, or the boy she had once loved and lost. As she flipped through them, she realized how much of her own life she had lived on the outskirts of motherhood, orbiting a son she had given away, always wondering if he felt the emptiness she did. She thought about that first night after leaving the hospital, the ache in her chest that no amount of distraction could numb, the sound of her mother's voice saying it was for the best, echoing like a ghost in every choice she made afterward. With trembling fingers, Brielle opened the oldest letter, written the night she turned 18, barely a week after Aidan's birth, and as she read her own words, she didn't recognize the girl who wrote them, so scared, so lost, and so full of guilt she could barely breathe. She had written about how sorry she was, about how she wished she could hold him just once more, about how she hoped he would be loved so fiercely that he'd never need to ask why she left, and it broke her heart to know he had grown up, asking anyway. The letter was stained in the corner, and she remembered crying over it as she sealed it, swearing she'd send it when the time was right, not knowing that the right time might never come. And yet, here they were now, sharing dinners and pieces of their stories, like survivors of a storm meeting years later, on dry land, unsure of what to say, but certain that silence could no longer carry the weight. Brielle knew she could never rewrite history, but maybe she could hand him the pen and let him write the future with her beside him, not behind. That evening, she placed the stack of letters into a worn shoebox, tied it with a ribbon she had saved from a baby shower gift long ago, and carried it with care to Aidan's apartment, her heart thudding with a mixture of fear and release. When he opened the door, he saw the box in her hands, and something in his eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding, as if he already knew what it contained, and was ready to open it anyway. She handed it to him without a word, only a nod, and he took it like someone accepting both an apology and a piece of truth, long withheld, letting the silence between them speak of forgiveness, slowly earned. They sat on the couch together, side by side, as he opened the lid and lifted the letters one by one, skimming the first lines, his eyes brimming with a quiet sorrow that made her throat tighten. He didn't read them all that night, just one or two, and then he reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that said, "I'm still here," and she smiled through tears that tasted of healing. In that moment, Brielle realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in 2 decades, that she hadn't missed her only chance, only the first one, and that life was still offering her another if she was brave enough to take it. They talked for hours that night, not just about the past, but about everything in between, the music he loved, the books she never finished, the little moments that made up 2 separate lives now trying to move forward together. She told him stories about his grandparents, about how her mother had been distant but never cruel, and how his grandfather had cried the night she came home from the hospital, empty-handed, a man who rarely showed emotion except when it came to family. Aidan asked questions he never thought he'd have answers to, and she answered them honestly, even when it hurt, because the truth felt lighter than the lie now, and he deserved that. The next day, Aidan brought the box with him to Claire's, and together they read more letters, her eyes wide with emotion as she followed his mother's journey through ink and paper. slowly witnessing a transformation shaped by regret and hope. Claire told him he was brave for opening that box, for letting her in, and he realized how much strength it took not just to forgive, but to receive someone's attempt to be better after they'd hurt you. He began to write back, not letters to Brielle, but letters to his own pain, to the boy who used to wonder why his mother didn't want him, telling him that he was wrong, that she had always wanted him, just didn't know how to be the mother he needed back then. The writing helped heal places he didn't know were still broken, and in that process, he found pieces of love that had waited patiently beneath the surface. Brielle, for the first time in years, felt the warmth of purpose settling back into her bones, and she started volunteering at a community center for young mothers, quietly using her story to help others make decisions not out of fear, but out of strength. She never shared Aiden's name, never used her story for sympathy, but simply showed up with honesty and grace, telling the girls that sometimes we get second chances, but it's best not to need them. Aiden visited one evening and watched her speak, pride rising in him like sunlight through a storm, and when she caught his eye from across the room, she smiled like someone who was finally home. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in the truth of that, they found something even stronger than time, reconnection built on earned trust, and a love that refused to stay buried. Claire's birthday arrived not long after, and Brielle surprised her with a hand-sewn quilt stitched from old shirts. Aiden had outgrown and scraps from her own childhood clothes, each square a memory, a bridge between past and present. Claire hugged her tightly, moved beyond words and whispered, "Thank you for giving me him," and Brielle's heart broke open in the best way, filled with gratitude and aching joy. That night, the three of them sat around the table, laughing over homemade pasta and cheap wine, and Aiden looked at them both and realized he wasn't missing a family. He was building one. Later, as they walked Brielle to her car, she turned and looked at him, really looked, and said, "I left you once, Aiden, but I'm never leaving again." And he believed her. In that moment, he understood that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who carry the most love for us. They just didn't know how to give it before. As the evening air cooled and stars blinked awake above them, Aiden stood on the porch, watching the world move gently around him, and felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. The ache hadn't vanished, but it no longer controlled him. It was now just a part of his story, not the whole. He turned to Claire and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for staying." And she whispered back, "Always." In the quiet of that night, with the past behind and the future unwritten, Aiden knew that love didn't always arrive the way you hoped it would. But when it did, it was worth everything. And deep down he also knew there was still more healing to do, more bridges to build, more truths to face, but this time he wouldn't do it alone. The morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of Aiden's apartment, casting a warm glow over the scattered papers and books that had become a part of his daily routine since reconnecting with Brielle. And as he sat at his desk, he felt the weight of a new chapter pressing gently against his chest, a chapter written with both hope and unresolved pain that still whispered beneath the surface. Brielle had stayed the night for the first time in years, and although the closeness was unfamiliar, it was not unwelcome. It was a reminder that the past might have shaped them, but it no longer controlled their present. Aiden's phone buzzed with a message from Claire, checking in and reminding him gently that healing was not a straight line, but a winding path with steps forward and back, and he knew she was right. There were still conversations to be had, tears to be shed, and forgiveness to be given. both to his mother and himself. Brielle was downstairs, making coffee and humming softly, a small sound that filled the empty spaces of his apartment with a strange sense of belonging, as if the years between them were shrinking in the quiet moments. He wanted to believe that the hard part was over, that the regret and silence were finally behind them. But deep down he knew that every new beginning carried shadows of old wounds waiting to be faced. When Brielle came back upstairs with 2 mugs of steaming coffee, Aidan caught the slight tremor in her hands, and without words they both understood that this fragile piece was as new to her as it was to him. A tentative truce built on years of longing and mistakes. They sat side by side on the worn couch, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable, filled with unspoken apologies and tentative hopes. And for the first time, Aidan reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face in a gesture both simple and profound. She looked at him with eyes full of tears and whispered, "I want to make this right, not just with you, but with myself." And those words, raw and honest, pierced through the years of pain like sunlight breaking through clouds. Over the next few days, they began to rebuild their relationship not as mother and son burdened by the past, but as 2 imperfect people learning to trust again, sharing stories and laughter, and even pain, with an openness that neither had dared before. Brielle confessed her fears and regrets, revealing the loneliness that had haunted her nights after she left the hospital, and Aidan shared his own scars, the nights spent wondering if he was loved, and the moments when he'd wished for just one sign that she cared. The barriers they had built around their hearts slowly started to crumble, replaced by something fragile but real, a bond forged from honesty and the willingness to try. Despite the progress, shadows lurked in the corners of their renewed connection, especially when Brielle's past choices clashed with Aidan's present realities, reminding them that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. Brielle hesitated to meet Claire again, fearing judgment or rejection, but Aidan encouraged her, saying that family wasn't just about blood, but about the people who chose to stand by each other through the hardest times. Together, they planned a visit to Claire's house, an act that felt both brave and necessary, a step toward healing old fractures and weaving their fractured family back together. The day of the visit arrived with a nervous energy, the air heavy with anticipation and unspoken fears. But as they crossed the threshold into Claire's warm kitchen, something shifted, a fragile peace, settling like a balm over old wounds. Claire greeted Brielle with a smile that was both cautious and welcoming, and in that simple act, Brielle felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to fall away. The 3 of them sat down to share a meal, stories flowing between them like a river seeking its path, laughter breaking through the tension, and for a moment, the past seemed less like a weight and more like a bridge. Yet, beneath the laughter, Brielle wrestled with a quiet storm, a deep-seated fear that she might never fully belong or be forgiven for the choices she had made, and that fear threatened to unravel the fragile piece she was building. Aidan noticed the moments when her smile faltered, the way her eyes searched for acceptance, even as she doubted she deserved it, and he reached for her hand under the table, grounding her with the simple touch of someone who believed in her worth. The conversations that followed were honest and sometimes painful, with Claire sharing her own struggles and disappointments, and Brielle opening up about the sacrifices she had made and the love she had buried beneath years of regret. They talked about loyalty, not just to family, but to themselves, and how sometimes love meant letting go, and sometimes it meant holding on, even when it hurt. In those moments, they realized that family was not a perfect picture, but a tapestry woven with threads of sacrifice, forgiveness, and unwavering hope. Brielle left that day feeling lighter, the heavy cloak of shame slowly lifting, as she embraced the imperfect, beautiful reality of the family she was rebuilding. Back at Aidan's apartment, as evening settled like a soft blanket, Brielle and Aidan sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker and pulse. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to dream not just of what had been lost, but of what might still be gained. They spoke quietly of plans for the future, weekend visits, shared holidays, and the possibility of creating new traditions that belonged only to them, free from the shadows of the past. Brielle confessed her desire to continue volunteering and to help other young mothers facing the same fears she had once felt alone in, and Aidan offered to help, knowing that healing often came through connection and purpose. Together they imagined a future where regret was replaced by gratitude and sacrifice by mutual support. And in that vision, they found a fragile but growing hope that love could indeed heal the deepest wounds. As night deepened outside, Aidan reached for Brielle's hand once more, their fingers intertwining with a quiet promise that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, lined with old scars and new challenges, but for the first time, it was a road they walked side by side, no longer strangers bound by pain, but family united by love and forgiveness. Aidan's heart was a storm of emotions as he navigated the fragile new relationship with Brielle, the woman who had once been a stranger but was now slowly becoming his mother in ways he had never imagined possible. Every shared story, every tear shed together, chipped away at the walls they had built over decades of silence and pain, revealing a tender hope that maybe, just maybe, family could be rebuilt on the ruins of regret. Brielle was learning to live with the consequences of her choices, and Aidan was learning that forgiveness was not just about forgetting, but about understanding the wounds that shaped them both. They found themselves in quiet moments of reflection, the weight of their past, pressing heavily but no longer suffocating, replaced by a cautious trust that grew with every conversation and every shared smile. The lessons they were learning were hard, about sacrifice, about the complexity of love, about loyalty that transcended years of absence, and yet, within that pain lay the seeds of something beautiful and new. Brielle was grateful for Aidan's patience, and he was grateful for her willingness to try, and together they began to see that contentment was not found in perfection, but in acceptance. Their days grew filled with tentative hope, marked by small gestures of care and understanding, as Brielle helped Aidan face the fears he had carried since childhood, and Aidan helped Brielle confront the loneliness that had haunted her nights. The bond they were rebuilding was imperfect, sometimes fragile, but it was theirs, and in that belonging lay a powerful kind of love that neither had expected to find after so many years apart. Yet, even as they grew closer, they knew the journey ahead would not be easy, for the past had left deep scars that would take time and patience to heal fully. Brielle continued to attend therapy and support groups, learning to forgive herself, while Aidan began to open his heart to the idea that family was more than blood. It was about presence, honesty, and the courage to try again. They began to talk openly about the future, not as strangers forced together by circumstance, but as mother and son choosing to walk side by side into whatever life had left for them. In those moments, they discovered the true meaning of loyalty, not blind allegiance, but a commitment to stand by each other through the hardest of times. One afternoon, Brielle received a letter from a social worker she had once met, informing her that her child's adoptive family wanted to meet her, sensing that closure might help them all. The news stirred a whirlwind of emotions in Brielle's heart: fear, hope, guilt, and curiosity, all colliding at once. And she knew this was a turning point she could not avoid. Aidan supported her decision, reminding her that sometimes the bravest thing to do was to face the past head-on, no matter how painful it might be. The meeting was arranged in a quiet cafe, where Brielle sat nervously, waiting for the adoptive parents who had raised her son with love and care. When they arrived, warm smiles greeted her, and Brielle felt an unexpected wave of relief. This family had given her child a life she could never provide at that time, and they treated her not as an intruder but as a vital part of their son's story. Together they talked for hours, sharing memories, hopes and fears, and for the first time, Brielle felt a true sense of peace settle within her soul. The adoptive parents expressed their gratitude for her courage and honesty, and Brielle realized that family was not about ownership but about love and sacrifice. That meeting sparked a new chapter of healing for Brielle and Aidan, one where past regrets no longer chained them but propelled them toward forgiveness and understanding. Brielle began volunteering at a local shelter for young mothers, using her story to inspire others and offer hope where it was needed most, while Aidan found solace in reconnecting with his roots and building a life that honored both his past and his future. Their renewed relationship became a beacon of light in their lives, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could be healed with patience, love, and the willingness to try. They learned that contentment was found not in erasing mistakes, but in embracing them as part of the journey, and that gratitude grew from recognizing the sacrifices made along the way. As the years passed, Brielle and Aidan became not only family but friends, two souls who had weathered the storms of abandonment and regret to find a home in each other's hearts. Their story was a testament to the power of love, the strength of loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that tie us together, even when life tries to tear us apart. In the quiet moments before sleep, Aidan often reflected on the journey they had taken, the pain, the healing, the unexpected twists that led them back to each other, and he understood that regret was a heavy burden, but one that could be lifted through forgiveness and gratitude. Brielle, too, found peace in knowing that her sacrifices were not in vain, and that love in its many forms had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Their story, once marked by loss and silence, had blossomed into one of hope and reconciliation, teaching them both that family is not just given but chosen, nurtured and cherished through every trial. Together they looked to the future with open hearts, grateful for the second chance they had been given and committed to building a life where love and loyalty would always come first. The past was a chapter that shaped them, but it no longer defined them, and in that realization lay the greatest gift of all, the freedom to love without regret and to live with contentment. Yet, beneath the laughter, Brielle wrestled with a quiet storm, a deep-seated fear that she might never fully belong or be forgiven for the choices she had made. And that fear threatened to unravel the fragile piece she was building. Aidan noticed the moments when her smile faltered, the way her eyes searched for acceptance even as she doubted she deserved it, and he reached for her hand under the table, grounding her with the simple touch of someone who believed in her worth. The conversations that followed were honest and sometimes painful, with Claire sharing her own struggles and disappointments, and Brielle opening up about the sacrifices she had made and the love she had buried beneath years of regret. They talked about loyalty, not just to family, but to themselves, and how sometimes love meant letting go, and sometimes it meant holding on, even when it hurt. In those moments, they realized that family was not a perfect picture, but a tapestry woven with threads of sacrifice, forgiveness, and unwavering hope. Brielle left that day feeling lighter, the heavy cloak of shame slowly lifting, as she embraced the imperfect, beautiful reality of the family she was rebuilding. Back at Aidan's apartment, as evening settled like a soft blanket, Brielle and Aidan sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker and pulse. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to dream not just of what had been lost, but of what might still be gained. They spoke quietly of plans for the future, weekend visits, shared holidays, and the possibility of creating new traditions that belonged only to them, free from the shadows of the past. Brielle confessed her desire to continue volunteering and to help other young mothers facing the same fears she had once felt alone in, and Aidan offered to help, knowing that healing often came through connection and purpose. Together they imagined a future where regret was replaced by gratitude and sacrifice by mutual support, and in that vision they found a fragile but growing hope that love could indeed heal the deepest wounds. As night deepened outside, Aidan reached for Brielle's hand once more, their fingers intertwining with a quiet promise that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, lined with old scars and new challenges, but for the first time, it was a road they walked side by side, no longer strangers bound by pain, but family united by love and forgiveness. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline as Aidan and Brielle sat on the worn bench in the park, where they had shared their first honest conversation years before. The gentle rustling of leaves whispering the passage of time, and the soft promise of healing yet to come. The air was filled with a quiet understanding that forgiveness, though still a work in progress, had begun to echo through the spaces between them, weaving a fragile tapestry of trust and acceptance that neither had dared to hope for so long. Brielle reached out and took Aidan's hand, her fingers trembling slightly, but holding firm, a silent pledge to face whatever shadows remained with courage and love. They spoke softly about the journey they had traveled, the pain of abandonment, the years of silence, and the small victories of every step toward reconciliation. And with each word the ghosts of their past grew fainter. Aidan shared how the loneliness of childhood had carved deep scars in his heart, but how the chance to know his mother now was like a balm, soothing wounds he thought would never heal. Brielle confessed that her regret was a constant companion, a heavy weight that had shadowed her every choice, but that meeting Aidan again had given her the grace to forgive herself in ways she never imagined possible. Their conversation was not free of tears or trembling voices, but it was filled with the raw honesty that only true healing could bring. As night settled softly around them, they found comfort in the understanding that family was not about perfect pasts or flawless choices, but about the willingness to grow and change together, no matter the cost. The bench beneath them seemed to hold the weight of years of unspoken sorrow, but also the lightness of new beginnings, a place where forgiveness could take root and flourish. Brielle spoke of the lessons she had learned about sacrifice, not just the sacrifices she had made for Aidan, but the sacrifices he had made in his own life, carrying the burden of her absence with quiet strength. Aidan listened, his heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and gratitude, realizing that love was often complicated and imperfect, but always worth fighting for. They talked about loyalty, the kind that was not blind but steadfast, a bond that held even in the face of pain and mistakes. Brielle's voice wavered as she admitted that her greatest fear was never truly being accepted by Aidan, but his gentle squeeze of her hand reassured her that acceptance was already blossoming. They promised to continue walking this path together, knowing that the road ahead would still hold challenges, but also the promise of love renewed. In the days that followed, Brielle and Aidan continued to build their relationship with small, meaningful moments, shared meals, late-night talks, and the simple act of showing up for each other in ways that spoke louder than words. Brielle found joy in volunteering at the shelter, often inviting Aidan to join her, creating a bond not only between them, but with the community that had once seemed so distant. Aidan began to open up more about his dreams and fears, no longer carrying the weight of abandonment alone, but sharing it with someone who understood. They faced moments of doubt and pain, of course, but these were met with patience and grace, the kind that comes from knowing that love is a journey, not a destination. Brielle often thought about the son she had once left behind, the child she had given up to protect, and how fate had woven their lives back together against all odds. She learned to be grateful for the imperfect path that had led her to this moment, where regret was transformed into hope and forgiveness into family. Aidan, too, discovered that the scars of his past did not define him but had shaped the compassionate, resilient man he was becoming. One afternoon, as they walked through the park hand in hand, Aidan stopped and looked deeply into Brielle's eyes, the sunlight catching the tears that welled there. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but full of emotion, "for coming back, for trying, for never giving up on us." Brielle smiled through her tears, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet contentment born from the love they had fought so hard to reclaim. They stood there for a moment longer, two imperfect souls bound by the promise of loyalty, sacrifice, and gratitude, a living testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of family. And as the evening shadows lengthened, they knew that while the past would always be a part of them, it no longer held them captive. Instead, it was a chapter that had prepared them for the beautiful story still unfolding. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline as Aidan and Brielle sat on the warm bench in the park, where they had shared their first honest conversation years before, the gentle rustling of leaves whispering the passage of time and the soft promise of healing yet to come. The air was filled with a quiet understanding that forgiveness, though still a work in progress, had begun to echo through the spaces between them, weaving a fragile tapestry of trust and acceptance that neither had dared to hope for so long. Brielle reached out and took Aidan's hand, her fingers trembling slightly but holding firm, a silent pledge to face whatever shadows remained with courage and love. They spoke softly about the journey they had traveled, the pain of abandonment, the years of silence, and the small victories of every step toward reconciliation. And with each word, the ghosts of their past grew fainter. Aidan shared how the loneliness of childhood had carved deep scars in his heart, but how the chance to know his mother now was like a balm, soothing wounds he thought would never heal. Brielle confessed that her regret was a constant companion, a heavy weight that had shadowed her every choice, but that meeting Aidan again had given her the grace to forgive herself in ways she never imagined possible. Their conversation was not free of tears or trembling voices, but it was filled with the raw honesty that only true healing could bring. As night settled softly around them, they found comfort in the understanding that family was not about perfect pasts or flawless choices, but about the willingness to grow and change together, no matter the cost. The bench beneath them seemed to hold the weight of years of unspoken sorrow, but also the lightness of new beginnings, a place where forgiveness could take root and flourish. Brielle spoke of the lessons she had learned about sacrifice, not just the sacrifices she had made for Aidan, but the sacrifices he had made in his own life, carrying the burden of her absence with quiet strength. Aidan listened, his heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and gratitude, realizing that love was often complicated and imperfect, but always worth fighting for. They talked about loyalty, the kind that was not blind but steadfast, a bond that held even in the face of pain and mistakes. Brielle's voice wavered as she admitted that her greatest fear was never truly being accepted by Aidan, but his gentle squeeze of her hand reassured her that acceptance was already blossoming. They promised to continue walking this path together, knowing that the road ahead would still hold challenges, but also the promise of love renewed. In the days that followed, Brielle and Aidan continued to build their relationship with small, meaningful moments, shared meals, late-night talks, and the simple act of showing up for each other in ways that spoke louder than words. Brielle found joy in volunteering at the shelter, often inviting Aidan to join her, creating a bond not only between them but with the community that had once seemed so distant. Aidan began to open up more about his dreams and fears, no longer carrying the weight of abandonment alone but sharing it with someone who understood. They faced moments of doubt and pain, of course, but these were met with patience and grace, the kind that comes from knowing that love is a journey, not a destination. Brielle often thought about the son she had once left behind, the child she had given up to protect, and how fate had woven their lives back together against all odds. She learned to be grateful for the imperfect path that had led her to this moment, where regret was transformed into hope and forgiveness, into family. Aidan too discovered that the scars of his past did not define him but had shaped the compassionate, resilient man he was becoming. One afternoon, as they walked through the park hand in hand, Aidan stopped and looked deeply into Brielle's eyes, the sunlight catching the tears that welled there. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but full of emotion, "for coming back, for trying, for never giving up on us." Brielle smiled through her tears, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet contentment born from the love they had fought so hard to reclaim. They stood there for a moment longer, two imperfect souls bound by the promise of loyalty, sacrifice, and gratitude. A living testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of family. And as the evening shadows lengthened, they knew that while the past would always be a part of them, it no longer held them captive. Instead, it was a chapter that had prepared them for the beautiful story still unfolding. The days that followed felt lighter, as if a new chapter of their lives had begun, one where the burdens of regret and abandonment had begun to lift, replaced by the steady pulse of hope and love. Brielle found herself waking up each morning with a sense of purpose, grateful for the chance to make amends, not just with Aidan, but with herself. She embraced the lessons of sacrifice and loyalty, understanding now that her choices, though painful, had been driven by love in their own flawed way. Aidan, meanwhile, discovered a new strength in vulnerability, learning that opening his heart did not make him weak, but brave. Together, they began to create memories that were no longer shadowed by the past, but illuminated by the promise of a shared future. And in those moments, whether quiet or joyful, they found the contentment that comes not from perfection but from acceptance, a gratitude for the twists of fate that had led them back to each other. Their story was no longer just one of loss and regret, but of love reclaimed, a powerful reminder that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the courage to forgive, the willingness to try, and the grace to love without conditions. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Brielle stirred awake, a newfound sense of calm enveloping her like a warm embrace, a feeling she had longed for through years of turmoil and regret, but had only now begun to grasp in its full depth and promise. Aidan was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, the aroma filling the small apartment with a comforting familiarity that symbolized the fresh start they both desperately needed after decades of silence and missed chances. Their conversations had deepened beyond apologies and tentative trust. They now spoke openly about dreams deferred, fears overcome, and the fragile hope of building something together from the broken pieces of their past. Brielle realized that this reunion was not just a second chance at motherhood, but also a personal journey towards self-forgiveness, where she could learn to embrace her imperfections and the consequences of her choices with grace and humility. Aidan watched his mother from across the room, seeing not just the woman who had abandoned him, but the person who had fought her own battles silently, and who now stood willing to be part of his life in ways he never expected. They began making plans, small steps toward healing that involved family dinners, visits to places filled with memories, and even counseling sessions to untangle the complex emotions that lingered beneath their fragile bond. Brielle's heart swelled with gratitude for these moments, understanding that love required patience and sacrifice, but also offered redemption and joy in return. As days turned into weeks, their relationship blossomed into something neither had dared to imagine. A partnership built on honesty, respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement of past pain that now served as the foundation for future strength. Brielle found solace in witnessing Aidan's achievements and struggles, cheering quietly from the sidelines as he pursued his passions and carved out a life that, despite its challenges, held promise and fulfillment. Aidan, in turn, began to appreciate the complexity of Brielle's life. Beyond the abandonment, a young woman forced to make impossible decisions, a survivor who had carried her own burdens with quiet dignity. Their shared moments, whether filled with laughter or tears, stitched together a tapestry of healing that grew richer with each passing day. The lessons they learned were not always easy. Loyalty was sometimes tested by old wounds. Regret surfaced unexpectedly in quiet hours. Contentment felt elusive when shadows of the past crept in. Yet through it all they chose love and gratitude, understanding that these were the threads strong enough to hold their fragile family together. Their story became one not only of reconciliation, but also of transformation, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the enduring power of forgiveness. One evening, as the city lights blinked to life outside their window, Brielle and Aidan sat side by side, their hands entwined, sharing stories of childhood, dreams and hopes for the future that now seemed brighter than ever before. Brielle reflected on the sacrifices she had made, and the love she had withheld out of fear and shame, realizing that true sacrifice was not abandonment, but the courage to face her mistakes and seek healing. Aidan, feeling the weight of years lifted, knew that loyalty was not defined by absence, but by the choice to return and rebuild, no matter how daunting the journey. Their hearts beat in quiet harmony, filled with gratitude for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them back together and given them a second chance to rewrite their story with compassion and understanding. And as they leaned into the comfort of each other's presence, they knew that while the scars of their past would always be a part of them, they no longer had to define their future. Together they embraced the promise of new beginnings, imperfect, hopeful, and filled with the enduring light of love. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Brielle stirred awake, a newfound sense of calm enveloping her like a warm embrace, a feeling she had longed for through years of turmoil and regret, but had only now begun to grasp in its full depth and promise. Aidan was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, the aroma filling the small apartment with a comforting familiarity that symbolized the fresh start they both desperately needed after decades of silence and missed chances. Their conversations had deepened beyond apologies and tentative trust. They now spoke openly about dreams deferred, fears overcome, and the fragile hope of building something together from the broken pieces of their past. Brielle realized that this reunion was not just a second chance at motherhood, but also a personal journey towards self-forgiveness, where she could learn to embrace her imperfections and the consequences of her choices with grace and humility. Aidan watched his mother from across the room, seeing not just the woman who had abandoned him, but the person who had fought her own battles silently, and who now stood willing to be part of his life in ways he never expected. They began making plans, small steps toward healing that involved family dinners, visits to places filled with memories, and even counseling sessions to untangle the complex emotions that lingered beneath their fragile bond. Brielle's heart swelled with gratitude for these moments, understanding that love required patience and sacrifice, but also offered redemption and joy in return. As days turned into weeks, their relationship blossomed into something neither had dared to imagine, a partnership built on honesty, respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement of past pain that now served as the foundation for future strength. Brielle found solace in witnessing Aidan's achievements and struggles, cheering quietly from the sidelines as he pursued his passions and carved out a life that, despite its challenges, held promise and fulfillment. Aidan, in turn, began to appreciate the complexity of Brielle's life beyond the abandonment, a young woman forced to make impossible decisions, a survivor who had carried her own burdens with quiet dignity. Their shared moments, whether filled with laughter or tears, stitched together a tapestry of healing that grew richer with each passing day. The lessons they learned were not always easy. Loyalty was sometimes tested by old wounds, regret surfaced unexpectedly in quiet hours, contentment felt elusive when shadows of the past crept in. Yet through it all they chose love and gratitude, understanding that these were the threads strong enough to hold their fragile family together. Their story became one not only of reconciliation but also of transformation, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the enduring power of forgiveness. One evening, as the city lights blinked to life outside their window, Brielle and Aidan sat side by side, their hands entwined, sharing stories of childhood, dreams and hopes for the future that now seemed brighter than ever before. Brielle reflected on the sacrifices she had made and the love she had withheld out of fear and shame, realizing that true sacrifice was not abandonment, but the courage to face her mistakes and seek healing. Aidan, feeling the weight of years lifted, knew that loyalty was not defined by absence, but by the choice to return and rebuild, no matter how daunting the journey. Their hearts beat in quiet harmony, filled with gratitude for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them back together and given them a second chance to rewrite their story with compassion and understanding. And as they leaned into the comfort of each other's presence, they knew that while the scars of their past would always be a part of them, they no longer had to define their future. Together they embraced the promise of new beginnings, imperfect, hopeful, and filled with the enduring light of love. In the weeks that followed, Brielle and Aidan began to introduce one another to the people who had shaped their lives, old friends, family members, and mentors who offered support and acceptance, reminding them both that love extended beyond blood and into the communities we choose to build. These connections brought unexpected moments of joy and laughter, easing the tension that had once defined their interactions and replacing it with warmth and understanding. Brielle often found herself overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers who had become friends, their acceptance a balm for the wounds she had carried silently for so long. Aidan, too, grew stronger through these relationships, realizing that family was a mosaic of people bound by loyalty, sacrifice, and love in many forms. They navigated difficult conversations about the past with honesty and patience, acknowledging the pain without allowing it to consume their present. Gratitude became a constant theme in their lives, a reminder that despite the hardships, they had been given the rare gift of reconciliation. Through it all, Brielle and Aidan discovered that contentment was not about erasing the past, but about embracing the imperfect beauty of the present moment, choosing love even when it was difficult, and honoring the sacrifices that had paved their way forward. The day came when Brielle stood before a room filled with people she barely knew, but who had become part of her chosen family, sharing her story with vulnerability and courage that surprised even herself. Her voice wavered at times, but the honesty in her words touched the hearts of those listening, creating a space where judgment gave way to empathy and understanding. Aidan sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor, and when she finished, he stood to speak about the son who had once been lost, but was now found, about the power of forgiveness, and about the love that had endured despite years of silence. The room erupted in applause, but what mattered most to Brielle and Aidan was the sense of closure and new beginnings that filled the air, a powerful reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, effort, and unwavering love. As they left the venue hand in hand, they knew their journey was far from over, but that they no longer faced it alone. The lessons of family, loyalty, regret, contentment, love, sacrifice, and gratitude had woven themselves into the fabric of their lives, creating a story that was as much about hope as it was about pain. And in that story, they had found not just each other, but the courage to believe in the possibility of redemption and the enduring strength of the human heart. The quiet hum of the city outside was a constant reminder that life moved forward, even when the heart was still learning to heal, and Brielle found herself grappling with emotions she had long buried, realizing that forgiveness was both a gift and a challenge that demanded courage beyond what she had imagined. Each day brought new moments of doubt, where memories of her past decisions clashed with the fragile hope she and Aidan were building together. Yet she knew that without forgiveness, both for herself and from Aidan, their newfound peace would remain just out of reach. Aidan too wrestled with the ghosts of abandonment, occasionally retreating into silence as the complexity of their shared history unfolded in unexpected ways. Yet his willingness to keep trying was a testament to the deep bond forming between them. They began attending therapy sessions together, where raw truths surfaced and old wounds were gently explored, revealing layers of pain and resilience that neither had fully understood on their own. The therapist guided them to see that forgiveness did not mean forgetting or excusing the past, but embracing it as part of their story, while choosing to live with compassion and hope. Brielle learned to let go of self-condemnation, understanding that her youth and fear had shaped her choices but did not define her worth as a mother or a woman. Aidan discovered that anger could coexist with love, and that opening his heart to Brielle's imperfections allowed their connection to deepen beyond the surface. Together they faced the heavy weight of forgiveness, recognizing it as a transformative force that could either break or rebuild their fragile family ties, and they chose to let it rebuild. Their conversations grew more honest and vulnerable, exposing fears and regrets, but also hopes and dreams, and through these moments, Brielle and Aidan found a shared strength that neither had known they possessed. They began to create new traditions, simple acts of connection like Sunday dinners, evening walks, and shared music playlists that fostered a sense of belonging and normalcy despite the scars of their past. Brielle surprised Aidan with a small garden on the balcony, symbolizing growth and patience, and each time he saw the tiny shoots, he felt a quiet reassurance that their relationship too could bloom with care and time. They spoke openly about sacrifice, with Brielle acknowledging the pain her decision had caused, and Aidan recognizing the hardships she endured alone. And in this mutual understanding, they found a new form of loyalty, one that was not blind but grounded in truth and acceptance. Their families began to tentatively welcome each other, bridging gaps of estrangement with cautious but hopeful steps, and Brielle saw the healing power of community as it helped ease the loneliness that had defined much of her life. Gratitude became a daily practice, with both mother and son expressing appreciation for the small victories, the moments of laughter, and the chance to rewrite a story once thought lost. They learned that contentment was not about perfection, but about embracing the messy, beautiful reality of their lives and choosing love even when it was difficult. One late afternoon, as Brielle and Aidan sat on the balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, Brielle shared a secret she had never told anyone before. The fear that had gripped her the day she left the hospital, the overwhelming doubt that perhaps she had made the worst mistake of her life. Aidan listened quietly, holding her hand, and in that moment, the years of distance melted away, replaced by a profound empathy that transcended the pain. He admitted his own fears too, the anger, the abandonment, and the loneliness, but also his hope that they could be more than what their past had dictated. They realized that their love was not perfect, but real, forged through sacrifice, regret, and the willingness to forgive. This understanding became a turning point, where both accepted that family was not defined by flawless decisions, but by the courage to face life's hardships together and the grace to keep trying. The sun dipped below the horizon, and as darkness settled, their hearts glowed with the quiet strength of healing, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness to transform even the deepest wounds. The quiet hum of the city outside was a constant reminder that life moved forward, even when the heart was still learning to heal, and Brielle found herself grappling with emotions she had long buried, realizing that forgiveness was both a gift and a challenge that demanded courage beyond what she had imagined. Each day brought new moments of doubt, where memories of her past decisions clashed with the fragile hope she and Aidan were building together. Yet she knew that without forgiveness, both for herself and from Aidan, their newfound peace would remain just out of reach. Aidan too wrestled with the ghosts of abandonment, occasionally retreating into silence as the complexity of their shared history unfolded in unexpected ways. Yet his willingness to keep trying was a testament to the deep bond forming between them. They began attending therapy sessions together, where raw truths surfaced and old wounds were gently explored, revealing layers of pain and resilience that neither had fully understood on their own. The therapist guided them to see that forgiveness did not mean forgetting or excusing the past, but embracing it as part of their story, while choosing to live with compassion and hope. Brielle learned to let go of self-condemnation, understanding that her youth and fear had shaped her choices, but did not define her worth as a mother or a woman. Aidan discovered that anger could coexist with love, and that opening his heart to Brielle's imperfections allowed their connection to deepen beyond the surface. Together, they faced the heavy weight of forgiveness, recognizing it as a transformative force that could either break or rebuild their fragile family ties, and they chose to let it rebuild. Their conversations grew more honest and vulnerable, exposing fears and regrets, but also hopes and dreams, and through these moments, Brielle and Aidan found a shared strength that neither had known they possessed. They began to create new traditions, simple acts of connection like Sunday dinners, evening walks, and shared music playlists that fostered a sense of belonging and normalcy despite the scars of their past. Brielle surprised Aidan with a small garden on the balcony, symbolizing growth and patience, and each time he saw the tiny shoots, he felt a quiet reassurance that their relationship too could bloom with care and time. They spoke openly about sacrifice, with Brielle acknowledging the pain her decision had caused, and Aidan recognizing the hardships she endured alone, and in this mutual understanding, they found a new form of loyalty, one that was not blind but grounded in truth and acceptance. Their families began to tentatively welcome each other, bridging gaps of estrangement with cautious but hopeful steps. And Brielle saw the healing power of community as it helped ease the loneliness that had defined much of her life. Gratitude became a daily practice, with both mother and son expressing appreciation for the small victories, the moments of laughter, and the chance to rewrite a story once thought lost. They learned that contentment was not about perfection, but about embracing the messy, beautiful reality of their lives and choosing love even when it was difficult. One late afternoon, as Brielle and Aidan sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, Brielle shared a secret she had never told anyone before. The fear that had gripped her the day she left the hospital, the overwhelming doubt that perhaps she had made the worst mistake of her life. Aidan listened quietly, holding her hand, and in that moment, the years of distance melted away, replaced by a profound empathy that transcended the pain. He admitted his own fears too, the anger, the abandonment, and the loneliness, but also his hope that they could be more than what their past had dictated. They realized that their love was not perfect, but real, forged through sacrifice, regret, and the willingness to forgive. This understanding became a turning point, where both accepted that family was not defined by flawless decisions, but by the courage to face life's hardships together and the grace to keep trying. The sun dipped below the horizon, and as darkness settled, their hearts glowed with the quiet strength of healing, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness to transform even the deepest wounds. The days following their heartfelt conversation were filled with a renewed sense of purpose for both Brielle and Aidan, as if a veil had lifted, allowing them to finally see each other not as strangers defined by past mistakes, but as kindred souls ready to rebuild what was lost. Each morning, Brielle woke with a quiet determination to be present in Aidan's life, not just as the mother who had abandoned him, but as the woman who would stand by him through all of life's storms. And in this commitment, she found a deep well of strength she never thought possible. Aidan, in turn, began opening up more about his own struggles and dreams, trusting Brielle with pieces of himself he had long hidden away, and their growing openness became a bridge that carried them beyond years of silence and hurt. They started planning small adventures together, visits to the beach, trips to the local art museum, and even cooking classes where laughter filled the kitchen and the tension of the past seemed to ease with every shared moment. Brielle's parents, initially hesitant and guarded, began to soften as they witnessed the genuine efforts being made, and tentative invitations for family dinners emerged, bringing warmth to spaces that had been cold for far too long. With each gathering, walls came down and stories were shared, weaving a tapestry of healing that slowly wrapped around them all. Brielle marveled at the resilience of the human heart, how it could shatter and yet knit itself back together with love and forgiveness as thread. In quiet moments alone, Brielle reflected on the journey that had brought her here, a path marked by youthful mistakes and deep regrets, but also by unexpected grace and second chances, realizing that life's greatest lessons often came wrapped in pain. She began volunteering at a local support group for young mothers, sharing her story with others in hopes that her experience might serve as both warning and hope. And this act of giving back infused her with a sense of purpose beyond her personal healing. Aidan threw himself into his work and studies with new vigor, inspired not only by the support of Brielle, but also by the knowledge that he was not alone anymore, that a family could be rebuilt even from the most fragile foundations. They continued attending therapy, exploring not just their relationship, but also their individual journeys toward wholeness, and these sessions became a safe space where honesty was met with compassion rather than judgment. There were setbacks, moments of frustration and doubt, but each time they stumbled, they chose to rise together, refusing to let the past dictate their future. Through patience and persistence, their bond deepened, teaching them that love was not a single grand gesture, but a series of small acts of loyalty, sacrifice, and gratitude, repeated day after day. They discovered that contentment was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning, connection, and acceptance. One chilly evening, as autumn leaves danced in the wind outside the window, Brielle and Aidan sat by the fireplace, sharing stories of their childhoods, the laughter mingling with tears as they uncovered memories long buried. Brielle told Aidan about the dreams she once had before fear had taken hold, and Aidan shared his hopes for the future, hopes that now included Brielle in ways he had never imagined. The room was filled with a quiet peace, a fragile but growing sense of family that transcended blood alone, forged instead by shared vulnerability and the willingness to forgive. They realized that though the past could not be changed, its hold over them could loosen, making room for a future defined by love and understanding. Brielle felt a deep gratitude for the chance to make amends and build a life with her son, a gift she vowed never to take for granted. Aidan, looking at Brielle with newfound respect and affection, understood that their journey was far from perfect, but it was theirs, a story of redemption and hope that would continue to unfold with each new day. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence, they found contentment not in what had been lost, but in what they had courageously reclaimed. The days following their heartfelt conversation were filled with a renewed sense of purpose for both Brielle and Aidan, as if a veil had lifted, allowing them to finally see each other not as strangers defined by past mistakes, but as kindred souls ready to rebuild what was lost. Each morning, Brielle woke with a quiet determination to be present in Aidan's life, not just as the mother who had abandoned him, but as the woman who would stand by him through all of life's storms. And in this commitment, she found a deep well of strength she never thought possible. Aidan, in turn, began opening up more about his own struggles and dreams, trusting Brielle with pieces of himself he had long hidden away, and their growing openness became a bridge that carried them beyond years of silence and hurt. They started planning small adventures together, visits to the beach, trips to the local art museum, and even cooking classes where laughter filled the kitchen and the tension of the past seemed to ease with every shared moment. Brielle's parents, initially hesitant and guarded, began to soften as they witnessed the genuine efforts being made, and tentative invitations for family dinners emerged, bringing warmth to spaces that had been cold for far too long. With each gathering, walls came down, and stories were shared, weaving a tapestry of healing that slowly wrapped around them all. Brielle marveled at the resilience of the human heart, how it could shatter and yet knit itself back together with love and forgiveness as thread. In quiet moments alone, Brielle reflected on the journey that had brought her here, a path marked by youthful mistakes and deep regrets, but also by unexpected grace and second chances, realizing that life's greatest lessons often came wrapped in pain. She began volunteering at a local support group for young mothers, sharing her story with others, in hopes that her experience might serve as both warning and hope, and this act of giving back infused her with a sense of purpose beyond her personal healing. Aidan threw himself into his work and studies with new vigor, inspired not only by the support of Brielle, but also by the knowledge that he was not alone anymore, that a family could be rebuilt even from the most fragile foundations. They continued attending therapy, exploring not just their relationship, but also their individual journeys toward wholeness. And these sessions became a safe space where honesty was met with compassion rather than judgment. There were setbacks, moments of frustration and doubt, but each time they stumbled, they chose to rise together, refusing to let the past dictate their future. Through patience and persistence, their bond deepened, teaching them that love was not a single grand gesture, but a series of small acts of loyalty, sacrifice, and gratitude, repeated day after day. They discovered that contentment was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning, connection, and acceptance. One chilly evening, as autumn leaves danced in the wind outside the window, Brielle and Aidan sat by the fireplace sharing stories of their childhoods, the laughter mingling with tears as they uncovered memories long buried. Brielle told Aidan about the dreams she once had before fear had taken hold, and Aidan shared his hopes for the future, hopes that now included Brielle in ways he had never imagined. The room was filled with a quiet peace, a fragile but growing sense of family that transcended blood alone, forged instead by shared vulnerability and the willingness to forgive. They realized that though the past could not be changed, its hold over them could loosen, making room for a future defined by love and understanding. Brielle felt a deep gratitude for the chance to make amends and build a life with her son, a gift she vowed never to take for granted. Aidan, looking at Brielle with newfound respect and affection, understood that their journey was far from perfect, but it was theirs, a story of redemption and hope that would continue to unfold with each new day. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence, they found contentment not in what had been lost, but in what they had courageously reclaimed. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow on the room where Brielle and Aidan sat together, a quiet comfort settling over them as they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point, a journey marked by pain, forgiveness, and unexpected grace. Brielle's heart swelled with a mixture of humility and pride, knowing that the woman who once left her baby in a hospital was now the mother who chose to stay, to love, and to fight for a family she had almost lost forever. Aidan reached out and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with a strength born of shared hardship and healing, a silent promise that neither would walk alone again. Their lives had been a tangled web of mistakes and miracles, sacrifices and second chances, and as they looked toward the future, they understood that the true power of family lay not in perfection, but in the unwavering choice to love, despite it all. Brielle's parents, now fully embracing Aidan as their grandson, gathered with them for a small celebration, laughter filling the room where silence had once reigned, and walls once cold now echoed with warmth and belonging. The stories of the past were no longer chains but bridges, connecting generations with lessons of loyalty, regret, contentment, and gratitude woven tightly together. Brielle realized that her regrets, though heavy, had not defined her. Rather, her willingness to face them and seek redemption had transformed her into a woman of courage and compassion. Aidan shared how their renewed bond gave him strength to pursue his dreams with a sense of purpose he had never known, and Brielle marveled at the resilience that had blossomed within him, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to heal and grow. Together, they planned for the future, not with grandiose promises, but with simple, sincere goals that reflected their shared values of family and love. A future grounded in hope and the lessons of their past. Brielle found herself volunteering more and more, inspired to support other young mothers, navigating challenges similar to those she had faced, turning her pain into a source of light for others. And in doing so, she deepened her own healing. Aidan's eyes sparkled with ambition, yet tempered by humility and gratitude. aware that his journey was intertwined with his mother's courage and the sacrifices she had made, even before they had reunited. Their story was no longer one of abandonment but of reconciliation, a powerful reminder that even the deepest wounds can be mended through honesty, forgiveness, and unwavering love. As the sun set on their gathering, Brielle and Aidan stood side by side, embracing the fullness of their journey, the heartbreak and healing, the loss and love, knowing that family was not just blood, but the commitment to stand by each other, come what may. In the quiet that followed, Brielle whispered a prayer of gratitude, thanking the universe for the unexpected gift of reunion and the chance to rewrite a story once filled with pain into one filled with hope, love, and the enduring strength of family. Aidan smiled, his heart lighter than it had ever been, understanding that contentment was not a destination, but a daily choice, to forgive, to love, and to be grateful for the imperfect but beautiful life they were creating together. Their past was a shadow that no longer haunted them, but a reminder of how far they had come, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the deep bonds that tie us to those we call family. Brielle knew she would carry the lessons of loyalty and regret with her always, but now they were tempered with grace, giving her the strength to embrace each day with an open heart. And as they looked toward the horizon, side by side, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound not just by blood, but by love, sacrifice, and a shared commitment to never let go again. The circle had been completed, a journey from abandonment to belonging, from regret to redemption, and from loneliness to the profound warmth of family.